Thanks for tuning in. My name's Andre Servin, and you're listening to Off the Roost podcast, brought to you by Off the Roost Custom Calls, turkey calls for the serious hunter. Join me and my co-host, Paul Murdahl, as we delve into the world of the wild turkey, covering everything from calling tips and tactics and hunting strategies to the latest equipment available, featuring interviews from special guests and custom call giveaways. We'll do our best to keep you up to date on this obsession we call turkey hunting. We appreciate you joining us. Now let's get on with the show.
So me and Paul, we're here with Shane Simpson of Shane Simpson Hunting. This guest does not need an introduction. I would say Shane's arguably one of the more, if not the most prominent turkey hunter in the state of Minnesota. And he has a YouTube channel, which is just Shane Simpson Hunting. And you just started slightly, not turkey related, but you started a deer tracker app, right, Shane?
Yeah, it's called Tracker, Trakr.
Okay.
We launched it in September, early September.
What does the app entail? What is it about?
Okay, yeah, I guess it'd be nice tell people what it's about. Hoping let curiosity get the better of them. They just go look at it and download it.
Right.
So basically, tracking dogs was legalized here in Minnesota back in, I think, 2019 or something like that. It's legal in just about every state except for just a couple. The hardest part for a hunter is, hunters don't think about trackers when they're out hunting until they absolutely need one. They can't find that, deer of a lifetime or that doe for that matter. And the first thing they think of is, where am I going to find a tracker from? It's not something they research ahead of time for the most part. And, they'll hop on Facebook or they'll start calling friends or asking around. And so and I'm a tracker, and we have our own issues to deal with. And that is coordinating tracks with other trackers. Like if someone calls me and they're 2 hours away, I can't help you. You're too far away. You're 2 or 3 hours away. I'll try to locate a tracker for them. And that eats up a lot of my time that I could be handling tracking calls nearby or being on a track. And there's a lot of things. I could go down a whole rabbit hole about it. But anyway, the app was made to streamline the process of connecting hunters and trackers together. And so basically, if you lose your deer, you lose the blood trail, you make an iffy shot, and you back out and you want to get a dog on it, you submit a request on this app. So it asks you a few questions, about 60 to 90 seconds. You fill out the request, hit submit, and it sends a push notification out to all the trackers in the area. So we get a notification on our phone. We open up the app. We see your details, where you're hunting at, the time you shot it, all the pertinent questions we're going to ask you anyway. And we have it all at our fingertips, and we can offer to track for you. And you'll get a notification saying, hey, I've got 3 trackers offering to track for you. At that point, you can look at their profile, their ratings and reviews, their fees, and pick the one you want, and then you just accept the tracker you want. It's kind of like Uber for tracking dogs.
It sounds like it's deer oriented. I mean, it sounds
it's big game oriented.
Big game. It sounds like it would be something that maybe you could go into, like chasing down crippled turkeys and stuff like that too. Maybe.
Yeah. So the services on it, the trackers put what their services are. So there's coyotes, turkeys, there's bear, deer. We had a survey of the United Blood Trackers. They surveyed all our members, and there was people that tracked tortoises, pet tortoises. So, yeah. So, I mean, they recovered them. They wandered out of their yard. They looked away, and all of a sudden the tortoise, I don't know how a tortoise gets away from me, but they lost it. And there were some requests for tortoises. But, pets are something people ask. We don't normally track. Most trackers don't track pets because, it's the dogs are mainly trained to track wounded game. And wounded game puts off different odors than a healthy animal. And so it's difficult to track those animals. But basically, animals that you can hunt, larger animals, coyotes and larger, will track them.
What kind of dogs are you using to track them with generally?
I have a blue tick coonhound, is my veteran dog, and I have a Boykin Spaniel, which we didn't get him for tracking. My daughter wanted him because she just liked the dog. My nephew had a litter of pups, Boykins, and she wanted one for a birthday gift, and she wanted to train it for turkey dogging, which is legal in Wisconsin in the fall, where the dog runs and scatters the flock, and then you sit down and call them in. And then she changed her mind. She wanted to train it for tracking. So he's a tracking dog too. There's a large variety of dogs used for tracking, and all of them do a great job at it. And there's wire-haired Dachshunds. There's Jack Russells. There's Labs. There's Bloodhounds. You name it. People are tracking with every single breed out there, it seems like.
Last spring when I was down in Mississippi, on one of the WMAs down there, I ran into a gentleman. I've seen him a couple times, and he was actually taking his dog out. It was a black lab, and he was a big tracker. That's what he was working on, training him. He was letting him go chase squirrels. Get in some exercise.
So you were down in Mississippi last spring turkey hunting?
Yeah, I was down in Mississippi for a couple of weeks last spring.
You apply? You went early season and applied for that non-resident permit, all that stuff?
Yes, it was my first time.
Okay, how'd you do?
I got my butt whooped.
Mississippi's good about that.
It was goofy weather-wise. I got down there right before the season start, and I heard stories about how super nice it was all spring, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to get down there, and the gobblers are going to be tearing it up. And as soon as I get down there, a record cold front comes through.
That's the way it happens every year I seem to go down there. It's nice leading up to opening day, and then the weather just turns to crap.
It was almost brutally cold one of the mornings. I think single digits for the lows the one morning. All the dogwoods started that were opening up. All the dogwood blossoms were closing up and shut the turkeys down for a number of days. Yeah. And they would seem like they were starting to get going again. And another cold front came through and shut them down. And then towards the end of my trip, they were in the northern part of the state where I was. They started getting fired up, but I had to come back home and go to work.
Yeah, I usually go down there the first part of the opener for Mississippi just because it helps me get an early start on the season. But if I had to choose, I'd go in April in Mississippi. I've hunted there in April, and it just seems the hunting seems to me to be a little bit better. There's less pressure. Most people have gotten their fill by then, the out-of-staters and the residents. Although the residents don't ever quit hunting, it just seemed like there was less pressure there in April, and I was able to get on birds there better during April. I think it's twice I've hunted there in April, and both times has been really good.
Right. I think I stayed till like the first part of that first week in April. I think I came back on a Thursday, and I had the last couple of days I had gotten in some birds, and they actually gobbled after they come off the roost for the first 2 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, if you were lucky enough to hear any gobbling, it was just on the roost. And as soon as they hit the ground, it was, you had no clue. You had no clue where they were going. And me being new to the area was like, well, I couldn't pick, well, maybe they're going to this spot or this spot, from past history, but I had none of that. So it was tough.
Mm-hmm.
In the nature of some of the woods where I did get on birds, with it being so open, it was a newer experience for me. I mean, I hunt a lot of early season, but there's brush and stuff where you can kind of hide up and stuff. And some of the areas that you walk through, you look around and you're like, how am I going to call a turkey to me in here? There's no place to hide.
Early season with no cover, it makes it even more difficult. When I've done it, the turkeys were in thicker, higher stem count areas, and things like that. And it's nice if you got some binoculars also. I keep forgetting to take binoculars with me because I rarely use them or have a need for them turkey hunting. But in situations like that, you want to scan up ahead, looking for that strutter. He'll move slightly, and you'll see like a fan or something. The hens, they're down pecking low, and they're just sitting in one spot. They don't create a lot of movement. It's hard to pick them up. But a big dark fan, all of a sudden, just how when they strut, they'll move forward quickly 5 feet. You'll see that movement. You'll catch it off in the distance if you just stare with some binoculars.
Right. I was a lot of times I'd try to use the landscape. Just get behind where they'd show up.
Mm-hmm.
And when they'd crested the ridge, they'd be in range. But I found a lot of what was happening is just past where they'd be out of sight, you'd hear a cluck. And I'm pretty sure, where I want them to come over and crest the ridge and be in shooting range, they were just coming up to the edge and just periscoping me and peeking and spotting me, and seeing me in that bare wide open, leaning up against a tree, and you'd never hear them again. You'd never see them.
Yeah, and they're hard to pick out too. If they just stick a head up, you better be looking in the right direction. You'll never see them. And that's cost me before, where a turkey pops up 10 yards to the right of where I'm expecting it, pops his head up, sees me, pops his head back down, and he's gone for good. And you hear that tactic mentioned often, where put yourself in position that they have to crest the hill within gun range. I've never liked that. I never liked them being able to pop their head up within gun range. I mean, I want them to expose their whole body within gun range. Maybe put a deadfall or something in between, or somehow position yourself where they can't just pop the head up. Make it and it's hard to figure that situation out a lot of times. If you get too far back from where they crest and they spot you, now they're out of gun range. But at least a lot of times I'll back up enough where they have to get up on the flat with me so I can see the whole body. And I can read their body language better than just seeing the jaw and up stick up. If you can see the rest of their body, how they're doing their wings and whatever.
I got to thinking the other day that maybe I was going to try to, instead of having them, popping their heads up and spotting me, maybe I was going to be set up where I was just going to be able to see over the top of and then I'd be able to see them coming and working, and they just have a view of maybe the top half of my head or my head.
That's a good idea. I did that this past spring. If you go back and watch I think one of the first video from last spring on my YouTube channel, I sat down right on the edge where basically, like you described, my head, I could see over the crest down the hill, and I saw them coming, and they worked right up there to me, within gun range, and they never saw me until they started cresting the hill themselves. But I could see almost the whole body the entire time. And then when they got up there where their head was high enough to see more than just my head, then they got suspicious. By then it was too late. I already had the gun on them and shot one. So I think you have the right thinking there. It's probably a better tactic to put yourself where you can peer over the ridge and see them down there. You just got to minimize your movement at that point until they get all the way into gun range.
Well, hopefully I get drawn again this spring and I can head back down there and check it out, see if it works.
I didn't even apply for well, they haven't opened it up yet, but I don't know if I'm going to apply this year. I didn't go down last year. Just that app is consuming so much of my time and money that I'm trying to stay within my budget and hunt locally. But there's plenty of opportunities around here in the Midwest to extend your season,
Right. The nature of my job is, well, I'm a heavy equipment operator. So during the winter, I generally get laid off.
Mm-hmm.
And that layoff will extend into maybe the beginning of April. Weather pending is generally about when I'm going to be going back to work. So that early season in Mississippi, I was doing Georgia for a long time, and they changed their regulations here, season dates here. So that's kind of.
What about
conflicts.
Florida? Do you apply for Florida?
I don't. I just, for some reason, I just don't feel it's not my I'm a hardwoods ridge eastern turkeys.
I got you.
That's what I get. I don't
That's me too.
sitting
I'm
down.
a Easterns in the hardwoods or Easterns
Right.
in the timber.
Yeah, sitting down in a swamp with mosquitoes and snakes and spiders and whatever just doesn't turn my crank.
Yeah, I've been asked that too. What's my favorite subspecies to hunt? And I'm like, I don't have a favorite subspecies per se. I do prefer Easterns, but I like hunting turkeys in the timber. That's my favorite type of turkey hunting. But I would prefer Easterns in the timber over any other ones. Florida, I'm like you. I mean, I don't worry about the snakes and stuff while I'm down there. I guess I grew up in South Carolina. We have snakes and black widows and, water moccasins and everything. And it was just a part of life. So I never even think about it. The odds of getting bit by a snake, people are buying snake boots all the time for turkey hunting. I just wear some hiking boots. Grew up there and never encountered a snake hardly, much less one that wanted to bite me. Anyway, I get off track a little bit. Florida to me is just a way to extend the season. I don't go down there for the subspecies to get a slam. I know that a lot of people are that's their goal. I just want to be in the woods turkey hunting. And again, to your point, it's not my favorite style with those palms and just it's nice down there. It looks nice, but I'd much rather be like in the hills of Minnesota chasing a timber gobbler.
Yeah, for sure, man. I know for me, and I obviously don't have anywhere near the experience of you guys, but my favorite place to hunt is Minnesota, over in the hills. And, I've done Iowa and Wisconsin in the hills, that whole region right there. But for some reason, Minnesota is just, it's different. It's a little bit steeper.
I think that helps. That's what makes the turkey hunting. There's a couple of pros to that. The terrain is fun to hunt. There's a lot of strategy there. It requires work, which makes it more rewarding when you get one. And then that work also makes it a deterrent for other hunters. And so you end up in some of those areas or pockets of less pressured birds, or a little easier to work, I would say. And so there's a combination of things that make it appealing to me.
Yeah, for sure, man. I agree with that 100%. So I kind of wanted to bring up some late season tactics. I feel for me that's really when it's because it's a interesting time. The woods have changed drastically from early season into late. All the foliage, the birds. There's less birds. The birds are behaving a little bit different. And it's also interesting too, because as we were speaking about earlier, there's less hunters out there, but the birds have been pressured now at this point. Late season is, it's a little bit more of a difficult time. And you seem to be a expert at late season. Almost sounds like it's kind of your preference, no?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say it's almost like it's too easy for me.
I would say that. I'd say that.
Sometimes I fear that people watching my videos sometimes see how easy it seems, and I fear that they'll start coming, and waiting till late season to hunt also, and then add more pressure to it. But I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's not extremely difficult to call them in the late season. It seems like if you do the right things, put yourself in the right positions. Yes, there are less birds, but I think there are more opportunities. And what I mean by that is early season, I'm going to just make this very simple. Say there's 3 flocks out there, and there's 10 birds in each flock. So now you got 30 birds. Well, those flocks are kind of staying together, right? And you're hunting basically 3 birds. Imagine the flock is 1 bird. So you're hunting one location, you're hunting 1 bird. And you shoot 1 or 2, the hunters shoot 1 or 2 out of each flock. Now you've got 6 less birds, you've got 24 birds. Late season, they split up. Instead of just 1 or 2 of the main birds, dominant birds gobbling in those flocks, now they split up and a lot of the birds are gobbling. So now you hear, this is just kind of a little theory I think of. There's more birds there's less birds, but they're more vocal. More of the birds are vocal. They're more dispersed, and so it gives you more opportunities to run into these birds. And now later in the season, even the dominant birds that were henned up, now they become vulnerable. And so there's been plenty of instances where, I hunt with other folks a lot of times because it's a one bird state. So I either save my tag or I field my tag, and so I'm looking for chances to go with others. And there's been numerous instances or seasons where we get on birds almost every single day, either an opportunity, a shot fired, or a bird killed. And that's just because, and I don't want to give the false impression that it's like super easy. We are putting in a lot of work. We're getting up at 3 a.m, and we're going out there and hunting until, early afternoon. And then we may take a slight break, and then we're back at it late in the evening trying to locate birds for the next day. And we're up and down those hills. We're putting on miles. So it's not like we just walk out there and kill a bird. So we are putting in some effort. But I've hunted early season where the birds aren't very vocal, or they're grouped up and only one or two of the birds in that group are vocal. And so now you're trying to find a needle in a haystack because they are bunched up. Whereas in the late season, every ridge top could have a bird. I've gone out there and owl hooted and have 4 or 5 ridges fired up with birds in the late season. So that's the appeal to me, and it also makes it a little, I don't know, it just feels like I'm in the game more, because if I can hear a bird, I feel I have a good opportunity to go kill that bird.
Right. Late season. Recently, I've been doing a lot of, I guess, large tracts of big timber.
Mm-hmm.
And the last couple of years, you talk about later in the season, they might be more vulnerable because the hens are nesting and whatnot. But, I've found the last couple of years that there's a lot of the gobblers were still henned up even on the last, May 31st, the last day of the season.
I was trying to think of, I'm trying to look at my calendar here. Was it last season or the season before? I think it was the season before, where, we were running into hens, or I was, or whoever I was with hunting, all the way until the end of May, where I'd see a gobbler with 4 hens, 5 hens. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. It just seems like they never lost their hens, or there was hens available all season long. And I'm not sure what the cause of that was. It just seemed like a fluke that one year. It didn't matter where I went. I was in Wisconsin, I was in Iowa, I was experiencing in Minnesota. Everywhere I went, I was seeing the same thing. And I don't know if there was some weather that contributed to hens losing their nest and they were, back with the gobblers, the breed, and restarted. I don't know.
Was it possibly, 2 years ago was the cicada hatch? And everybody was talking,
Did they have that up here? They don't have that.
Well, not so much here, but down south. But everybody was talking about, even up here, we had an excellent hatch that year. And maybe it was just the excess of hens that they were just available to them all season long.
Yeah, sometimes people, they give me hate when I mention this. Sometimes I think there's too many hens on the landscape. It's easy to say that up here in Minnesota, but down south where the population is struggling, they'll hang you if you mention that.
Right.
But I think it is true to some degree, because the landscape has a carrying capacity, and if you're just taking the males out all the time, those hens are living to be 10, 12 years old, and then they have babies, and they have some gobblers and some hen babies. And then you kill those gobblers. All you keep doing is leaving hens behind, and before long, at the very least, you give gobblers so many hens that you run into a situation where they never run out of hens, or they're just not very vocal. And so it gives the appearance, or that the numbers are lower because you're not hearing as many gobbling.
Right.
And that's, I don't have any facts to back that up. Just my thought process.
Right.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I know me and Paul, we were over in Wisconsin. I think this was about 2 years ago, and 3 years ago, and we had Tom roosted, and we got in really nice and tight. And
Too tight.
man, once the sun came up, it was like one Tom, and I swear there was like 6 hens. And this was the second to last day of the season. And yeah, that whole thing just kind of, a hen pitched down and almost pitched down on Paul. He could have touched it.
Right.
And then she noticed that and flew up into a tree, and she just nervous, putted up there, and then she just pitched off into the private property, and Tom followed her, but
they knew we were there, the hens, because we had each one of us were sitting on different trees, and each one of us had a tree right above us in the tree we were sitting in, and then out in front of me
in the tree above you,
right, and I heard the noises of her up there, and I was pretty sure she was out there, but I couldn't look up to check to see because she was right directly above me, and I had the gobbler was 35 yards out right in front of me. And
did you call at all, or you just sat there quietly?
We just sat there. They stayed on the roost for like an hour and a half past regular fly down time.
Well, because we were there.
Yeah. And
my opinion.
We were just sitting there. Yeah, because he was waiting for the hens to fly down, and the hens weren't flying down. And I could see he was getting aggravated with them because I'd watch his head go to bright red, and then he'd go back to the.
He didn't know why they weren't flying down. He was like, "Come on, ladies."
He was getting aggravated. And it was a heck of a show for me. Andre couldn't see it because he was facing off, and I was looking straight at him, and I was watching him. He'd gobble, and when he'd gobble, it was kind of funny. He'd cock his head back, and then he'd fire it forward and gobble out real loud when he was getting ready to gobble. But then when a crow would call or something, it would just be just pop off. And, right. Yeah. And I actually watched him once. He went to fire off a gobble, and he threw it out, and his foot slipped off the branch, and he almost fell out of the tree, and he caught himself, and it was pretty cool to watch.
I tell you, when I get in those situations where it gets light and there's a hen unexpectedly close by, I usually will call, especially if they start doing that nervous clucking, like they can see me there, because I want to drown out their putting or their nervous clucking, and it worked out for me a few years back in Minnesota where we roosted this gobbler and we got on this ridge with them. And it started getting light, and I could start hearing this hen. I couldn't figure out where she was at, and I finally noticed her. She was just barely behind a tree, but she was right there at like 15 yards away, 20 yards away, and she was up there going, pick, pick, pick. And so I just started doing some bubble clucks to her, and I'd soft yelp, and she finally calmed down. Even though she saw a blob there, we sat there motionless. I kept doing those little bubble clucks and little soft yelps, and she finally put out a few yelps, and then she would go back to that nervous clucking, nervous putting, just real soft putting. Like she thought she was suspicious, but she wasn't ready to give the full alarm. And because of that, our interaction, and here I was able to yelp some, that gobbler eventually just pitched down and walked straight to us, and I think it calmed him down or kept him from getting nervous. Right. So anytime I have hens, when it gets light, there are hens around, I'll start, even if that means calling loud, and cutting. And I'm sitting there with my gun up, and you can see me kind of move as I call because it takes, you got to use your lungs, obviously. And so you'll see little, yep, 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 yep. You see that little slight movement of my body. I'm willing to take that sacrifice for that little bit of movement because I want to drown out the hens that are nervous, and I want to keep that gobbler excited other than just sitting there and letting them get spooked. They're not going to come down to you or fly down. I don't think so. If they're nervous at a blob down there and you just remain motionless and quiet, they're going to remain suspicious. But if you can start throwing some turkey calls, at least my theory is that it will confuse them or something, and at the very least you're able to communicate with that gobbler.
All right. These hens would the only time I heard them was maybe when they moved on a limb and you could hear them scratching the bark. Is all I could hear. They weren't making any noise. And the one hen, back behind the gobbler, still directly out in front of me, she did just a half-hearted fly down cackle, and she jumped out of the pine tree and kind of circled around to the right, and then turned and come straight at me. And she went by. If I stuck my hand out, I could have grabbed her, and I could feel the wing. The
air from the wing.
The air from her wing as she went by, and at the same time she must have seen me, and she flared up and landed in a tree just behind us, next to where these other two were in her hand, above our heads. And after I think probably about 20 minutes, she ended up pitching down and going into the private land. And it wasn't too long after the gobbler pitched down and went into the private land. And at this time, me and Andre really didn't know that the two were still above us. And we've been sitting, not moving for 2 hours or better. And my legs were asleep, and I just wanted to get out of there. And we kind of got up and stumbled off as fast as we can to try to go regroup. And at that time, the two hens that were above us flew down and went into the private land.
Yeah. It wouldn't have mattered at that point. If the gobbler's gone, I don't care about the hens anymore. I'm going to stand up and let them spook.
Right.
But yeah, it's always that one hen though. I mean, you could have 10 hens around you and they start pitching down, but it seems like that one particular hen, wherever she goes, that's where the gobbler goes. Right. He's watching and listening for her. He doesn't care about all those ones.
And where we were set up, we were kind of in a stand of red pines, and there was just a little opening in the pines, and we kind of figured that's where they'd go. And she was heading right there. Yep. She actually would have went around the tree I was on and cut in front of the tree where Andre was, and then landed in that opening if she didn't flare off.
Yeah, for sure. I remember that. Shane, so I want to do, before we dive in a little bit more into the late season, I want to get a definition of late season. I know, and we could adjust this for other states, but I know for example here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, it's split up into weeks, and I think it's something like 6 weeks: A, B, C, D, E, F. I've always considered kind of season A and B, the first 2 weeks, as early season, C and D, C being middle, and I feel like D is a little bit of a transitionary time period.
Yeah,
where
I still feel D is kind of early.
Yes, early or like mid.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm just cutting the season in half. I'm like, yeah, so I guess mid season, but it just seems a little early for me to want to hunt.
What I've noticed about D is it seems like the first kind of half of the week, the birds are still kind of doing the mid-season thing. And then towards the end of D is when I start seeing gobblers crossing roads at like 10:30 a.m. And then season E and F, the last 2 weeks, I would say that's, for the most part, that's late season. Is that kind of correct? Is that kind of your frame of thinking there?
Well, the way I look at seasons, obviously, if you look at a calendar of if a state has a season, it runs from April 1st to April, whatever, May 1st, the last of May. So any state that has a calendar season like that, obviously the late season is the last week and a half of the season. To me, late season, when the hunting gets really good, is not based on the calendar, but it's based on what the foliage in the trees are doing. Once the trees greened out and you're getting that thicker foliage, that's late season for me. No matter where you're at in the country, once it leaves out and you get that thicker coverage, leaf coverage, then that right there is when it really changes. The hunting, it gets better for me. It gives you more opportunity to move without getting busted, more concealment. You're able to use the terrain better, easier, and it just seems like the birds, there's like a second season of, like the early season when they gobble a lot, they start gobbling again. And I don't know if it's because everything's greened out and their gobbles don't carry as far, or the hens have gone to nest, or whatever the reason may be. It seems to be at that point is when it really starts getting really good, the way I like it. And so in Minnesota, I grew up in South Carolina. Season opened on April 1st. By the second week of April, it had pretty much leafed out. And that's Minnesota's a month behind. So beginning of May here, but 2 weeks later, by mid-May, everything's leafed out pretty much. And so that last 2 weeks of May is when it really gets good here. And South Carolina was the same way. It was good early season there, but the last 2 weeks there, if you were that late season type of hunter, that's when it got really good too. You had less hunters to worry about, especially if you're a public land hunter like myself. And there were birds out there that were gobbling, and they seemed more eager to come to the call. I think that's the biggest benefit of late season hunting. Even though they've had more pressure, it seems like when you can get one to gobble, they almost come in like a pet turkey. I mean, they just throw caution to the wind and come right in.
Right, getting, you're talking about the foliage and stuff, and it probably plays together. But my comparison to early season, mid season, and late season would be, the progression of the breeding. You figure that early season is, they're just off of, just getting out of their winter flocks, and they're regathering, and their leks, I guess, would be the proper term, or loose leks or whatever. And, you get the gobbling on the roost, but nothing on the ground. The hens are around. And then you'll get into a little bit later in the early season and into mid-season where the hens are starting to breed. The gobbling lasts a little longer in the morning. The hens, some of them will be leaving. There's a better opportunity to find gobblers that aren't quite tied up with the flock, And then you get into the later season, supposedly, which I haven't really seen around here the last couple of years, where you get the gobblers, spread out like you're saying, no hens, more dispersed and easier to get on if you can get them to gobble.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, that the gobblers have lost their hen, you hear so much about. I don't know if it's as much of that as it is what I described earlier, where you have these flocks, larger flocks together. There's a lot of hens and say 6 or 7 longbeards, and then as it gets later in the season, some of these hens have gone off the nest, but that dominant gobbler or two still maintains those 4 or 5 hens that are remaining. The other 5 or 6 longbeards that were in that group have now paired up. You always see 1 or 2 together. Now they've kind of split off, and what you're doing is you're calling in those guys, and you're saying, oh, they lost their hens. No, they didn't lose their hens. They just finally left that flock, and they're kind of running together in a pair. And I think those are usually, and this is just my guess, that those are usually sibling longbeards. You see them in 2s or 3s. They're just brothers. That's why if you shoot one, or if you've been with a buddy and you pair it, you doubled up, the 2 gobblers are almost identical, spurs and beard and everything, and weight. They're brothers. They grew up together.
Just to finish up a little bit on that, I don't remember where I heard it, but the guy was talking about, if you get a pair of longbeards in,
don't shoot the strutter.
Don't shoot the strutter, but if you shoot the one, getting to the sibling part, he said the remaining one it'll be lonely, and it'll be really susceptible to calling in the following week.
Yeah, I've mentioned that myself in a podcast about someone asked me if a pair came in, which one are you shooting? And usually I'm going to shoot the first one that gives me a chance. If I got my gun up and they go behind a tree and the first one pops out, I'm shooting it. But if I had an opportunity to choose, I'm not shooting the strutter, because there's always a strutter, not always, but there's always seems to be a strutter in most cases, and a looker. The one that comes in, he's in the front, and he's just kind of nervous and looking around and stretching his head, and you got that one that's confident back there, relaxed, strutting. If you shoot that strutter, that looker who's so very cautious, now he's just going to be super cautious even more later, and he's not going to come in. I think the strutter is what brought him in to begin with. Go ahead and shoot that looker. Now that other one that was a strutter, he'll come in again later on. You can go out there, a day or 2 later and fill your second tag if you're in an area that you can use 2 tags. That's always been my theory. I know a lot of people like to shoot a strutter because they think he's the dominant bird. He's going to have longer spurs, but usually they have the 2 birds running together, usually about the same size anyway.
Right. Just more personality traits.
Yeah. I don't mind shooting lookers.
Nope.
So I'm glad that you brought up the pair because I actually have a question about this pertaining specifically to late season. You read about or people talk about the fact that when late season comes, some of these birds they start turning off, and maybe some of these birds that weren't dominant birds that they kind of start to get into summer mode. Is that something that what's your opinion on that? With some of these birds going into summer mode in the late season, so they're not interested, maybe they're not responsive to calling, or maybe they give you a courtesy gobble, but nothing comes of that.
I've run into that. Especially in the really late season. You know, I hunt Michigan. They have that extended season that goes into the first week of June, and I've run into birds that you can tell that they're starting to lose the interest. You know, they may gobble. You may even see them come in within sight, and they just kind of look your way. They peck, and just kind of cruise on by. They're not show. They kind of half strut. It's like they've lost their willingness to participate in the breeding period there. You start seeing these birds. The gobblers start flocking back up into their bachelor groups, I guess, for their summer flocks where the males hang out together. I've also had them, you know, in the late season where it's played to my advantage, where they're almost racing each other to get to this hen. All of a sudden, they haven't heard a hen that's, you know, they sit on the roost in the morning and gobble and then fly down, and no hens respond to them, and they fly down and do their thing all day. And all of a sudden, here's this new hen in the area, and they gobble and run to you. So I've seen both sides, you know, of the coin. But yeah, I've definitely seen them in the late season where it just starts waning. And what I tell people is, you know, don't waste too much time on one bird. Don't waste all your time on one bird. Go off and find another one that's willing to die, is what I say.
And yeah, that's something else I kind of want to talk about. I know I was doing a little bit of reading on, and this was a book by Ben Lee, and he was saying in the book to not spend so much time practicing your calls, to spend more time looking for birds.
Mm-hmm.
Just having that you know keeping those birds in your pocket, you know, all the different ones in different areas. How long will you give a bird more than one try? Is there a cutoff when you decide you're just done with that bird? Do you pattern the bird? Do you keep trying to make a move on them? How does that look?
I don't think I've ever patterned a bird. I kind of know the areas that they like, you know, just by roosting them. And like, yeah, usually there's a bird up on this ridge. I don't know if it's the same bird. How much time do I give a bird? There's one I had an incident with. He's the most famous bird in my career, probably, or hunting life. A bird I called RG. It just stood for Redemption Gobbler. I had hunted that bird and missed him, and I was dead set on getting him. And it was the same bird because it was just a teeny small couple acres of timber, and he was the only one in there. There was some across the road, and so I mean, he could have changed places with one of those birds. So in reality, it may not have been the same one, but in my head, it was the same bird. And I hunted him multiple times, and he was always giving me the slip. He'd gobble, and he'd start coming my way, but then he'd go quiet and slip around. And next time he gobbled, he'd pass me. He had a knack for that. I even took a buddy over there to try and kill him, and he did the same thing to us. I'd already told him ahead of time what he'd do, and sure enough, as soon as he got in a low spot, we couldn't see him again. He quit gobbling, and the next time he gobbled was behind us. He just circled around, and he probably came by spitting and drumming. We just couldn't hear it, but you know, I think hens can hear that drumming better than we can. And I gave up on that bird. I said, I'm going to find a different one. We went and we killed a couple other birds, and then I came back and hunted him after giving him like a week or two break, and then killed him.
I think, if I remember correctly, you were hunting him in the rain one morning and you missed him. Yeah.
That's the one. I sat there for, I don't know, 2 hours, 3 hours. I can't remember how long it was. And the temperature was like hovering around upper 30s to low 40s. And it was just a steady drizzle, a light drizzle, I guess, but enough to soak me. My hands were so numb that I have a Mossberg with the thumb safety. I could not feel my thumb. I could not push the safety off.
Wow.
I was that numb. I'd sat in the shooting position for that long, almost that long. And I don't know if that contributed to me missing, but I missed, and he flew up or he ran off and stopped and stood there for a little bit. And the hens that were kind of behind the little hill, he walked over and joined them, and then they all walked off together. And I walked out of there. I was pissed. I said in the video I wasn't mad, but I was mad at myself really for screwing up. But there's been instances where I've abandoned a gobbler fairly quickly, and one instance in particular was, I think, wasn't last season before last. I think I posted the video last winter, right before turkey season started. I struck this bird, and I went after him, and I got set up on him, and I heard a hen start yelping. I knew he had a hen with him, and they didn't budge. I heard another bird gobble on the next ridge. So I just got up and walked away from him, and I spent, 20 minutes or longer trying to get over to the other bird. And I called to him a little bit. He didn't sound very interested. And another bird on the next ridge gobbled to my call, and I was getting birds fired up, and I was about to abandon him. I wanted to find that bird that would just run in. And I ended up, the bird, he had a hen with him as well. But they were talkative enough where I slipped around the ridge, and I popped up behind a little rock outcropping, and I called that hen, and she came over there, and me and her calling back and forth to each other was enough to pique his curiosity, and he made the mistake getting in gun range. So if I have another bird, I can hear one gobbling, I will hop up and leave the bird I'm working, pretty readily. But then if there's not a lot of gobbling going on, there's a bird in the area, I'll give him a couple tries. But I don't want to ever make the mistake like with RG again, where I spend multiple days set on this. I spent a week or 2 weeks, probably a week and a half on this bird before I finally gave up and went after. And that was a week and a half of no success. I was working the same bird over and over, and then I left him, and we filled 2 or 3 tags pretty quickly, because I wasted so much time on this bird, and I could have been, not only getting on the other birds that were probably more callable, if that's a word, but I always look at opportunities to hunt in different areas and hunt different birds also as an opportunity to learn more about different areas, new areas. The more I know, like in the 15 years I've been here in Minnesota, I've hunted so much in Minnesota. I've hunted so much of the Wisconsin and some parts of Iowa that I have a large database in my head of places I can just at a moment's notice.
It really helps.
Just a thought. Yeah, I can just, okay, nothing's going on here. I can run over there. And so if you dedicate too much time on one bird, then you're not, learning about other birds and learning about other areas.
Right. I think I fall into the trap a lot of times when I'm in a new area, and I find a bird and I stick with them quite a bit and waste a lot of time. I had actually done it in Missouri about 3 years ago, and I had him. I think the closest I had him was like 50 yards, and he was just a little out of range for what I felt comfortable shooting him. But I hunted him. I hunted him, I bet, at least five of the, and I probably that year I was able to hunt a good, between rainstorms, I was able to hunt a good, 7, 8, 9, probably 10 days down there. And I kept going in after him. And he wasn't always there, but he always would show up later in the morning. If he wasn't there in the morning. And I burned up a lot of time. And in the last morning of the season, I was actually in there. I'd gone off, finally left them and gone off to a couple other spots that morning, and it didn't pan out. And I had 2 hours left before the season was over, and I raced all the way down there and got in there and got set up and did some calling and whatnot. And season end came, and I got back to the truck, and I realized I think I had left a pot call back against the tree. So I went back in the woods to get my pot call, and as I was coming back out, he had crossed the road, and he was gobbling like crazy, not 70 yards away from where I was sitting, and he walked right down past me, gobbling and gobbling and gobbling all the way, and it was like he was laughing at me, telling me to go home, you lost.
Yeah.
Go back to Minnesota, boy.
Yeah, and on the flip side about sticking with birds too long, even when there's not a vocal bird, and let me explain this so people understand it better. You can go into it. Say you're in a new area, like for instance, I went to Mississippi and hunted, and I stumbled on a bird. Luckily, one morning, the first morning I was there, went in there blind, and I was careful to try not to fall into the trap of hunting that area multiple times just because I heard that bird in there once. It could have been a fluke. He could have been busted by another hunter and flew there, and that's why he was roosted that morning. He could have been bumped there, the previous evening. I had that happen in Alabama one time where I think that's what was the case. The gobbler pitched down that morning. He gobbled, and he was like running, and he like went a mile away gobbling. I think he had been bumped the previous day. But basically, the point is that just because you hear a bird there one morning, and maybe you go off and hunt other areas of the public land, you're not hearing birds, don't get sucked into the trap of coming right back to that area just because you heard him there once. I did that in Mississippi on that hunt. I came back a day or two later, and I went in there and blind called and set up and blind called. It just didn't look like a very good turkey habitat. Not much sign for scratching anything, but I was like, well, he was in here roosted. But that also could be a trap. You can waste time in an area that just because you heard him gobble there once doesn't mean that's a normal area for him. And so I quickly abandoned that spot after that second time in there. And I was like, I needed to cover ground and look for the freshest turkey sign and, abundance of sign. And that's what I did. I finally found an area just by covering ground. I could have easily got sucked in that trap, not just like the same thing as hunting a bird over and over just because he's gobbling, but getting sucked in the trap because you heard one there once and now you're like, this is the spot to be, and then you waste 2 or 3 days in a place void of turkeys.
So this is going to lead me into something else I want to kind of bring up, into the scouting, so you're not wasting your time on these. How are you scouting differently late season? I mean, watching you on your videos, from what I can tell, you're doing a lot of roost scouting where, when I roost a bird, I go into an area. A lot of times I'll have a gun with and I'll sit and I'll wait and I'll just listen. But you seem, you're moving around. You'll check this area, and you do a lot of owl hooting in your coyote yelps.
Yeah.
And if you don't get a response or you get a response, then you're off to the next area, 3-4 spots in an evening you'll be checking.
Yeah, my strategy is to cover as much ground in the evening to try and locate one, or just to cover as much ground to locate one in general. But if I was going into a new area, I'm looking at the map, and depending on where you're at in the country, the cyber scouting varies quite a bit. Water is kind of my big key in, not necessarily the top one, but like in the hill country, I'm not so focused on water as I am on ridge points, and particular ridge points, ones that have some woods on top, kind of flat. I've described them in with other conversations, but I'm looking for a particular style of ridge point. If I'm in flatter terrain, like say in Mississippi, not only am I looking at the tree cover, I'm looking for those, what do you call it? Those edges, transition lines where mature pines may meet smaller pines, or it may meet with a clear cut. All those transition lines that attract wildlife, turkeys, deer, whatever. And if I can find that with some water in flatter terrain, I'm looking for little creeks and stuff. Not only are the creeks, the water sources a draw for wildlife because they're going to drink water, but it allows me to scout along the creeks and find fresh tracks where they've crossed it, or things like that. And so it varies wherever I'm at in the country. Out west, I'm not looking for water per se. I'm looking for cottonwoods or big roost trees, areas where the turkeys are going to roost. But anyway, back to the point. If I cyber scout an area and I have some spots picked out, I try to map them out so that in the evening, if there's roads close enough, I can start at one, and I usually start right around official sunset. That's usually when the birds get into the tree, right around official sunset or just a few minutes after. And so I'll start there. I'll hoot something, it's a little not so high volume. And then I'll do the cattle waller. And if they don't gobble to the owl hoot, and then I'll resort to the coyote howl. And then I hop in my truck and I haul butt to the next spot. And I do that in areas where there's no roads, where I can't cover, from the vehicle, where I can cover as much ground as possible. I try to find a ridge or something that I can hear from one spot as far as possible. And I do the same thing. And so, my goal is to put ears on as much landscape as possible in the evening. I know it's harder in the South, for whatever reason, maybe all the years of pressure on those birds. They don't gobble like they do in the North and the Midwest in the evening to locator calls. Your best chance to hear one down there gobbles in the morning. And that's in the morning. If I don't hear one gobble in the evening, I pick my best, what I think is the best spot on the map, and I go there and I'm sitting in there at daybreak. Sometimes I stray from that strategy. I'll just listen from the road or something, where I can hop in the truck and bolt off a mile down the road and listen from another spot a few minutes later.
So that spot you're picking, it's not necessarily an area that you think is going to have turkeys in it. It's more of a spot you think you'll be able to hear a long ways.
Yeah. So let's take Illinois, for instance. I hunted there a couple of years ago, and I picked a ridge on there, not where I thought there would be turkeys on that ridge, but I could hear almost a mile in multiple directions, other ridges, and I could coyote howl and then, pinpoint and say, okay, I need to be there tomorrow morning. For the morning hunt, it's a mix. Sometimes I like to be on a ridge where I think a turkey might, the one that has the highest probability of a turkey being roosted on or nearby, just from the terrain and what's around. And then, as a side effect of that, if that ridge or that particular spot, not necessarily a ridge, depending on where you're at in the country, hopefully I can hear a bird in the distance as well, and I always try to plan also a route. Like, suppose I don't hear any gobbling in the evening and I don't hear any gobbling in the morning. Where am I going to cover on foot? And I'll look at a spot. You know how these national forests and stuff, sometimes they have so many access roads, and you can walk a mile and end up at another gravel road somewhere. So I try to find a spot where I can walk and cover several miles, and I stay away from another road on the other side where another hunter's going to come for me, and just cover some ground walking and calling. Obviously, there's some benefits to, hunting from the road, if you will, or trying to locate from the road. But I think you have to get into the woods with these turkeys sometimes, just listening. They may not be gobbling. You may just hear them spitting and drumming, or you may hear a hen yelp. That's what I do when I get into those walking stages where I'm covering miles. I'm not in a hurry to cover a tremendous amount of ground. I'll walk a little bit. I'll stand there and listen. I may make some soft yelps. I try to walk like a turkey, like 2 or 3 steps, and then stop and listen. It just varies. It's situational dependent on what strategy that I use. But my goal is to put my ears on as much landscape as possible, basically.
Okay, so I was going to ask, since we moved into this, I have a couple questions. One of them is going to be locating late season gobblers. My second question is, so let's say a guy purchased a tag for an earlier season. Maybe there were some birds there. Maybe he wasn't able to seal the deal. Late season comes in, he scoops up another tag. Will a bird still be using the area maybe that he found some birds in the early season, or have they moved away from that area? And how nomadic do some of these late season gobblers behave?
That's a good question. I mean, I've seen birds, and I'm assuming they're the same birds that were on this ridge one day, and they're a mile away the next day. And then, we all, I think, have our own thoughts on what turkeys do and how far they go, et cetera. And then you see these GPS studies that come out, today's technology, and you see gobblers that are traveling, 2 or 3 miles, or hens that are going that far in a day. Not necessarily a straight line, but they're covering some ground.
Right. Then you got same studies where they're showing the reverse where
Yeah, they don't
the
move
gobbler
anywhere.
the gobbler sits in, one area for the whole season, and they've even put people on them saying, here he is with the GPS going and hunt him. And the gobbler was there. The people never seen him. And he
Yeah.
was only like 40 yards away from them.
Yeah, they seem to have a knack for that sometimes. The bird stayed in a 20-acre area the entire season. There was I forgot who was telling me this. There was a gobbler that had a collar on it, and every opening day, he would disappear. He was like, he knew when the opening day was, and he would head to this one property. And they finally went over there to that property, and it was a little old lady that owned some private land or something. There was a little green field behind her house, and that's where that gobbler ended up. He spent his whole season. As soon as the season ended, he went right back to the public land. I think it was Mike Chamberlain was telling me that.
Yeah,
Right.
that's got to be the smartest gobbler, man.
Yeah, like I don't know if he heard the maybe it's the increase in traffic the evening before and people trying to locate birds. That gobbler said, "Uh-oh, it's on." And the next morning he pitched down and he made a beeline for that private property and hung out there the entire season.
I could definitely see that. I mean, when I was in Mississippi for their opening weekend that Saturday morning,
Mm-hmm.
it was gravel popping for the hour before sunrise and for 2 hours after, constant.
Yeah.
Where the days prior to that morning, it was pretty peaceful in the morning, but it was constant cars driving that opening morning, and they were making a lot of noise. Right.
Yeah, we're training the gobblers. We're training them. And what would you got to ask that question again, because I know I missed half of it or part of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I guess part of it is if a guy locates birds early season, buys a tag late season, and tries going back to that same area, are the birds still going to be there? Or from that transition of early season to late season, have the birds shifted and they're no longer in that area? And how to go about finding new birds if that's the case?
So what I typically see, I'll answer this several ways. I've seen areas where there's no birds and then birds are there later in the season. And areas where I've seen birds in the early season, there are still birds there in late season, but there's not as many. They maybe dispersed or they just do whatever they do. So I think there's always, if you're seeing birds there in the early season, it's a good chance you're going to have at least a couple there still later in the season. There's a reason they were there. The habitat had to be conducive for them to survive there. So obviously it's going to be attractive for them. And it varies across the country. Down south where they don't have the severe winters, the birds don't act like they do up here. Up here in the upper Midwest where the winters get really cold, I noticed the birds kind of flock up and travel to an area, kind of yard up, if you will, like they talk about deer doing. I've seen in Wisconsin, this one near a dairy farm, there was like 300 turkeys there wintering. And when I first moved up here to Minnesota, I scouted in the winter one time. And I was looking for turkey sign. I didn't find any turkey tracks. I didn't find any sign. I was like, there ain't no turkeys around here. But what I quickly discovered was as soon as spring comes along, everything melts away and it starts greening up, that flock of turkeys, 300 turkeys, that's 5-10 miles away, disperses across the countryside here or the county side or wherever. And now you're finding birds in May where it was void of birds in March. And so I guess to answer your question, yeah, if you're finding birds in the area in the early season, there's a good chance you'll probably find them in the late season. And what was the other half of your question?
How to go about locating late season gobblers?
I think I described that earlier. The way I scout, I'm trying to cover as much landscape, put my ears on as much. My preference for locating birds, I know people get so ingrained with things they're taught by the old timers growing up, like, oh, don't use a coyote howler, that'll shut them up, And I think I would have proven them wrong by now if you watch my videos. I have no problem. Don't owl hoot in the middle of the day. Use a crow call in the middle of the day. Use owl hoot in the evening or early in the morning. I have a lot of success getting them to gobble to an owl hooter in the middle of the day. It's not something they commonly hear. They hear crows all throughout the day. Coyote howls. I think coyotes have been around long enough. The birds have learned that they're not a threat unless they get within like 20 or 30 yards of them. They've learned to deal with them. I've seen videos of Kansas where coyotes come running by them and they just kind of run out of the way and then go right back to their business. So I think that's a good locator call. Is that higher pitched sound of that? If you heard my coyote howls, that I do the bark just to try and sound realistic, but I do that loud scream. That high pitch really pulls a gobble out of a bird. Now, with that said, I've had the flip happen where they don't gobble to a coyote howl or the caterwauling of the laugh of a barred owl, but they'll gobble to just the ooh, for whatever reason. They'll gobble that, but they won't gobble to the aggressive stuff. So I usually start off soft, and then I work into that, my owl hooting, and then work into that caterwauling and that laughing, that wah, wah, wah. And if that doesn't work, I do the coyote howl, and I'm not afraid to use it at all times of the day.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, especially with your owl hoot, 11 o'clock in the morning, you don't seem to be shy about pulling that out and throwing some hoots out.
Here's another thing.
It seems to work pretty well for you, too.
Yeah, I'd say it works better in the northern half of the country than it does in the south, but I've had some success with it down south, too, because everyone down there just seems to want to do the natural voice, ooh, or something. Here's something a lot of people don't think about, and it's worked well for me, is using a turkey call to get them to gobble on the roost. And it just goes back to the old timers saying like, oh, I don't want to educate them, or whatever. He's gonna be suspicious the next morning. He hears you down there cutting on a pot call. No, he's not. These birds, they're wary, but they're not bright. They can't formulate, what's going on. So if I can't get one to gobble to an owl hooter or a coyote howl, I'll grab my glass pot call and I'll start cutting on it. It could be sunset or 10 minutes after sunset. It's starting to get dark, and I'll start yelping. I'm not worried about why that gobbler wondering why there's a hen on the ground cutting and yelping when it's almost dark. They don't have that logic. But it is oftentimes if you can't get them to gobble to an owl hooter or a coyote howl, they will fire off to a turkey that's calling excitedly.
I want to take you back a little bit where we were talking early to the late, and how you possibly change your thinking about Merriam's. You were saying early season, there's a good chance there'll be gobblers later in the season. With Merriam's, they're usually in more rugged terrain. And I hear a lot of, people talking about, follow the snow line, as the snow line goes up the hill, the turkeys are generally going to be located somewhere, around the snow line.
About like in the mountains?
Yeah, in the mountains, more rugged.
I don't know if I've ever hunted actual mountains, like, where there's a snow line that,
right. I mean, well, you get earlier season in the Black Hills,
yeah.
You can get a snow line transitioning up, I would think, from the bottom to the top there.
Quite a bit from this side of the Black Hills. You may be in elevations of 2,000 to 3,000 feet. On the back side, deeper in there, it gets up to 7,000 feet or something.
Right.
And yeah, it's quite a difference there. Yeah, I guess I've never hunted when it's, when I hunt out there, I don't really have a different strategy or as far as location for the birds. Black Hills especially, I think the water is I mentioned that earlier. I really focus on water out there. It seems like anytime I've hunted out there, first thing that the birds do in the morning, and the gobblers are following the hens fly down and they head down to the creeks to get them a drink of water for the day. And then they, go do their thing. Not always, but it seems like it's more often than not. And so when I'm scouting like the Black Hills and anywhere, like flat terrain, like I mentioned earlier, or in the Black Hills, I don't want to focus too much on Black Hills, but when water comes into play in areas like that, I'll focus on finding water. And the main reason, like in the Black Hills, because it's so monotonous, it's nothing but hills of pines. There's nothing that really separates one area from another. And you get out there and start hunting, and all of a sudden you'll find a pocket of gobblers, or you hear some gobblers, and there's a pocket of turkeys there, And for some reason, they're drawn to this one, half-mile square area. They seem to. They may not be in the same exact spot, but they're in that area within hearing distance. And then you can go 5 miles and not hear another bird, and then you'll find another pocket, and you're like, what's drawing these birds to this spot? There's water in both spots, but it's hard to figure out exactly what else is drawing them to that location. Maybe at that point it's pressure. Black Hills get a lot of hunting pressure. Maybe these are spots that are kind of secluded in the and in one case I know it's secluded. If we drove several miles back in there and then hiked another 2 miles to get back into this spot, and then we found a flock of turkeys.
That's what that's what I had to do past season. That's about what it took for us to get on birds. We went a little bit further, and yeah, man, it's tough out there. I know I checked my phone at the end of the day and I had something like 16 miles logged on my phone, and I'm like, God, man, this is, I know.
Feet feel it the next morning.
Oh yeah.
Kind of staying on the same. I mean, we had talked to Chad Claycomb here the other day, and I brought up the deal with elevation changes. As far as late season, a lot of guys.
Now, Chad lives in PA, and he lives and hunts actual mountains, Virginia's,
right,
PA.
Right. And
so he's a little more knowledgeable in that area.
So you don't generally get into the mountains area very often.
No, I haven't hunted out there yet, and that's been a plan of mine to hunt. I guess the biggest mountains I've hunted is the bluff country along the Mississippi River here in Minnesota, Wisconsin. 350 feet elevation changes. I take it back. I hunted Virginia a few years back. I forgot about that. So I have one season of experience, or a few days.
From what Chad was explaining, the area they hunt is pretty similar to the bluff country.
Okay, yeah.
He said where he thought maybe it would help in where areas you're talking about, the West Virginia, the bigger rugged mountains, but he really didn't have any personal insight really on it.
When I hunted Virginia, I wouldn't really compare those mountains to like the bluff country, because the way the bluff country here is created by erosion. The mountains in Virginia, when you think of a mountain, you think of the slope. It runs forever. It's not like ridges popping out, little finger ridges coming out all over it like it does in the bluff country. So there is some differences there. What I noticed there, the turkeys, there really wasn't a rhyme or reason for the turkeys there. We'd hear some about, 2/3 of the way up the mountain gobbling, but then we'd hear some near the bottom in the valley gobbling. So you could find them in different places. Now there were some little nuances that I started picking up on. Even though you have this big slope of a mountain, there might be a little bump, or just a little rollover in the side of the hill where it created like a little bench or something. Things like that seem to attract them. Just a slight change in the shape of the mountain. It wasn't the same old the whole way. So I was starting to pick up on that, little changes in the side of the slope of the mountain that attracted them. But I only had a couple of days there, so I still got a lot of learning to do.
Shane, so let's say a guy's got some birds located. What does the hunting strategy look for that? Is there any shift that you do when it comes to tackling long or late season bird?
So when did I locate this bird? Did I locate it the evening before? Did I locate it that morning, middle of the day?
Let's say the guy went out listening in the morning, found some birds, and
so he's far enough away. He's not going to get to this bird before fly down, or
he's not.
He's got to move to this. Okay.
Yeah.
What is my strategy? I've located a bird in the morning.
Yep.
It's gotten light. Usually I just head towards the bird. I'm gonna look at the map. With today's technology, I'm looking at satellite images, and I'm looking at trying to figure out what I think he's gonna do, where he's gonna go. If I'm in hill country, I think he's usually gonna, and then like where I hunt up here, there might be a field or something. I think he's gonna stay on that ridge, and he's gonna slowly work his way back towards that field or toward the edges of those fields. And I'm gonna try and get above him. And I'm gonna try to get there as quick as possible. As soon as I hear him gobble, I'm not just gonna keep listening. I see a lot of guys on these videos. they'll listen to this bird gobble, and they'll start making their way to them, and they'll listen. And obviously, it's video, so you lose a lot of context of what's going on. But it just seems like they're not in a hurry. I'm usually busting my tail to get there as quickly as possible without sounding like an elephant going through the woods. And I'm gonna try to get as close as I can. I'd like to be within 200 yards of him, if I can. Depending on the late season, you can get much closer with all the foliage, and then get in the desirable side of him. Whatever I decide is the best side to be on, which he's likely to go to. You have from when they first start gobbling till they fly down. They fly down around official sunrise. Just like they go to roost around official sunset or just a few minutes after. I always look at my watch. I'm always marking when sunrise. Most turkey hunters know when official sunrise is because you need to know that to know when official shooting time is. And so I always look at my time when they fly down. And I've learned over the years that it's usually pretty close to official sunrise.
Yeah.
So when you hear that, I'm talking too much about other irrelevant stuff, but it is relevant. From the time you hear that first gobble, you've got until official sunrise to get in position, get set up, or he's going to be on the ground. And that may be 5 minutes, that may be 15, 20 minutes, depending on how early you heard him. And so I'm watching that time, and I'm trying to get there as quickly as possible. Plus, the lower the light level, the easier it is to get tighter to him without spooking him. Sorry to make these answers drawn out, but there's so many variables depending on where you're at. I wish if you said if you gave me a spot on a map and said, "Tell me what you're going to do here," that'd be easier to answer.
Right. So now let's go a little farther. You've gotten in, you've gotten close, and the fly downs happen, and the bird, for whatever reason he gobbled up a hen while he was on roost, and they start working away from you. And this is probably going to be more of a compliment than a question, but I've noticed you have an uncanny ability that you don't pressure the birds too much. You have a good feel for knowing when to hang tight and when to move. You call to them. Your calling seems to be fairly aggressive from what I see, and
yeah, that's kind of one thing I disagree with a lot of people on when they say you're calling too much to a bird. I'll just touch on this real quick, and then I think as long as you're sounding like a bird or a turkey, you're not, and you're saying turkey things, you're not going to alarm them. And so I think it's better to call more than it is not to call at all or call very little. You keep as soon as you stop calling, you lose their interest. I think as long as you're doing something, you're keeping them at least their attention on you. It's slowing their retreat away at least.
Right. Well, you'll stay with them, through from what some of the videos I've seen for the better part of the morning, and sometimes you'll sit for 2 hours, sometimes you'll be moving in 15, 20 minutes. I mean, I guess it's probably more situational awareness, that's going to tell you, when to move and when to stay. But you seem to have an uncanny ability to know when to hold tight. And
I don't
I'm wondering,
feel that way.
And I'm wondering, what your thought processes are going through when a bird starts walking away. I suppose the terrain, is going to depend on whether you can loop around them and stuff like that, or are you going to go down to where they had just left and try to call them back?
Yeah, I'm very indecisive, and I've had people comment about that. When I'm going through my thought process, I guess in my head, I'm going through the movie War Games with what's his face back in the day. Do you want to play a game or whatever?
Yep.
And the computer's showing the nuclear warheads.
Ralph Macchio or whatever.
Yes. That's a great movie. Yeah.
Yeah, all the scenarios. Who would end up winning? It goes through all. I'm doing that in my head. Okay, if I go this way and this happens, what's going to be the outcome? All right, what if I do that? I'm trying to go through all those scenarios, and my mind fights with itself about scenarios and the decisions I should make, and then I start second guessing. So it's not easy. It may look easy because sometimes I get lucky and make the right decision. But but I'm weighing my options numerous times. And then sometimes I just go with my gut, and the first thought that pops in, I take off with it. And like you said, terrain is very much a part of how I move on. When I decide to move, how I move. For instance, me and a buddy were hunting in Minnesota. Was it 2 years ago? I think I released that video this past February or whenever. We spent 6 hours with that flock. We roosted them the evening before. Just the way the terrain set up, it had like a little finger ridge that came down, and they had clear cut on one side. I didn't know it. It was thick with briars, and we were kind of hopping around, bouncing around, but the terrain allowed for it. There was enough rollover in that ridge that we could stay just out of sight, but could hear them on the other side. And plus, they were vocalizing the owl hooters throughout the morning, and so that made it easy to stay in contact with with them and their location. And finally, part of the decision in that one was because I'd moved around so much, I learned so much in that 6 hours of bouncing around of what the terrain was like. And I'm like, they only really have one obvious direction to go, and that was up through that little valley on one side of the hill, because of that clear cut on one side, and we were already up on top of the other, and it was thick with buckthorn and stuff. And I was like, turkeys aren't going to want to go through that. It's too thick. They will go through it. It was open enough, they would, but I thought, yeah, they're probably going to shy away from them, especially if there's hens and stuff involved and multiple birds. So I picked a spot on the map. I'm looking at it. I'm dropping a pin where I think they're still at. There's a little bench. I was like, okay, there's like a little deer trail here. They may come walking up through here. And that's what we did. We sat tight, and it worked out. So I don't know what your original question was, but there's a lot of thought going into it. And it's like I said, there's so many factors. How many birds that I'm dealing with? Is it a whole flock? Is it multiple longbeards and adult toms or whatever? Are there jakes in the mix? What's the terrain like? There's so much going on. It's hard to give an answer for a plain and simple answer. Obviously, I want to try and get in front of birds if I can, if they're moving away from me. But if they're just kind of bouncing around in one little area, I'm in no hurry to move. As long as they're still in the general area, they're just kind of milling around. My biggest fear is I've been getting a little more aggressive in the last year or two. My fear in the past has been I'm always scared I'm gonna bump them. But I start thinking to myself, you know what? Something fantastic usually happens when I just take a chance. You either blow the hunt or something great happens. There's nothing more boring than just sitting there waiting and letting that opportunity slip out of your hands. So now I've gotten a little more aggressive.
I guess one of the reasons it intrigued me is because I find myself I'm always just holding back just a little too long, and I wanted to make sure that they were clearing the area. But by the time I hear that last gobble and I decide it's time to move, I lose track of them. I can't.
Yeah,
ever find
I'm
them.
sitting here nodding my head because I'm in total agreement. That's been a problem for me. I've always tried to wait to the right time, and then I wait 20 minutes too long, and then I'm out of the game. And again, sometimes I'm worried that I'm moving a little too early, and that has happened to me where I thought the birds had drifted away. Okay, it's time to move. I go to move, and they had just worked back quietly, and they were right there. And so there's no real right answer, but I think the tip that's always given when you think you should move, give it 30 more minutes. I think that's bad advice sometimes. I think when you think you should move, you should have moved 30 minutes earlier. Maybe start thinking in that mindset.
It could go both ways.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
When it comes to the late season hunt, we're picking up, so you got within maybe 200 yards of this bird. What's I guess once you start calling to that bird, one thing I want to talk about that, because it's interesting, because some people, and you mentioned this, some people will say, oh, well, I'm only going to scratch the leaves and cluck. It's late season. I don't want to get too aggressive with it. But like you were saying, on the other hand, it seems like you really call to these birds. Have you ever had it, I guess, in the case where the calling has shut the bird down? And what's your opinion on kind of taking that more conservative route?
Well, yes, I definitely had them, but it hasn't been very often where my calling shut them down. It's been very few instances. And Garrett Prawl, he was with me on that one hunt. My buddy Garrett Prawl, he has a YouTube channel also, but he and I were having a discussion about aggressive calling. And what I told him was, my thoughts are, if you were to flip, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to word this properly. Okay, say you had 4 gobblers you're going to end up encountering. The first gobbler, you took it easy and just called conservatively. But and then the next one you called aggressively. And the next one you called conservatively. Next one you called aggressively. So you're kind of splitting your odds there. 3 of those 4 gobblers may have been more interested in your aggressive calling, or 3 of those 4 gobblers may have been more interested in your conservative calling. But you don't know what those odds are, and so you kind of have to see what I'm getting at. So basically, if you go in with one style of calling all the time, I think aggressive calling is more productive across the whole board of gobblers. If you had 10 gobblers, I think 7 of them would respond to aggressive calling more than conservative calling. That's kind of my thought, and that's why I go into my hunts calling aggressively more often than not. Now, with that said, I start off a little conservative. But, I may, if I get set up on a gobbler, like you said, I have him located 200 yards away, I may start off with just some bubble clucks and some soft yelps just to test him, to see what he's going to do. He may just gobble and come running right in. I won't need to do anything else. But I'm usually going to end up, if he holds his position or he's slow coming in, I'm usually going to add in some more aggressive calling. And then I don't just go wide open. I may add some cutting and some excited yelping, and then just a few soft yelps here and there just to keep things going. I'm not one of those guys. I'm probably never just going to go in there and go a few clucks and rake the leaves and then shut up. That's just not me.
Yeah.
It's that I don't want to deer hunt turkeys. And when you get to the point where you scratch and rake the leaves a couple times and then sit there and wait for an hour because he's gonna finally get interested, I ain't got time for that.
Well, and then I noticed you're not. I guess I noticed you use a Jake or a gobbler yelp quite often, and in the videos I was watching, I didn't see if it was late season, early season, or whatever. Is that something you'll try throughout the season?
Yeah, so I don't have a style that shifts during the season. Like, I've been asked this before, like, what is your strategy for decoys? I don't use decoys anymore, but I used to. And then, like, what is your strategy for decoys throughout the season as they change in their phases and stuff? And I never really had a strategy for that. I used to primarily just use the one Jake decoy. I've been asked the same thing about my calling. How does your calling strategy change? My calling only changes based on the situation that morning. If I'm working a flock, or if I'm working a long beard with a bunch of hens, or I'm working a long beard with a couple of jakes nearby, that dictates my calling, not the time of the season. And just like when you're using decoys, I've seen it like a jake decoy, and I used to paint their head, add some red and white to it to make it stand out. Those things are deadly when it comes to having a gobbler out there. If he just sees a hen decoy, he can display to her at a distance, and if she's not coming to him, well, obviously she's not interested. But if he sees a jake over there and he hears a hen, my calling, now he's got to. The only way he's going to run that jake off is he's got to approach it and get within gun range. Same thing with jake yelps. Those gobbler sounds, gobbler vocalizations, jake vocalizations really seem to do something to gobblers. You can hen yelp out to your heart's content, but something about jake yelping makes that gobbler want to come in. Not all the time, but especially if he has some jakes nearby, those other jakes, get interested and they come in and they'll pull that gobble with them. So I've had a lot of success with jake yelps, gobbling. I don't use it. I guess I use it often. It depends on your definition of often. I use it when I feel like it's necessary, or I use it when I feel like it's a last resort. Like the bird, he's kind of hung up, or he's got hens with him. Iowa last year, for instance, we had a whole flock of birds, lots of gobblers, and I Jake yelped. That didn't do much. I mean, I've been hen yelping stuff all morning. I Jake yelped, and then I gobbled, and that gobble was finally what I think struck their interest in the whole flock. I think the second gobble or something like that, the whole flock came over the hill. I think it's a deadly call, but
Yeah, for sure. I actually want to touch on foliage a little bit because I know you mentioned that. I've noticed a couple of things, at least like in my opinion, on what happens with the foliage. For me, I feel a little bit like it gets a little bit more difficult to call the bird in because there's so many small little areas that they can peek through. And then maybe they're seeing you or they don't see the hen where you're calling from, and maybe they don't come in and they just walk off quietly. Or there's always a possibility that there's a silent gobbler that comes in, peeks through the foliage. You can't see him, but he doesn't see a hen and he just walks off. You didn't even know he was there.
To your point about the foliage where you're talking about they're coming through looking for a hen, I find it gets them closer to me easier. Because they can't see as far, and so they have to come in tight to try and find that hen. And I love the foliage. Now it has its drawbacks. It has worked against me before because you got to stay vigilant and you can't sit there with your gun relaxed. When you got a bird gobbling and he goes quiet, just assume that he's on his way. Get your gun up and aim. I mean, have your cheek down. You don't necessarily have to have your left eye closed to aim, but have your cheek down and be aiming. Have your knee propped up and the gun situated. Because what's going to happen within 10 or 15 minutes of silence, all of a sudden you're going to see a neck pop up around some foliage looking. And he knows exactly where that last call came from. And I've had it cost us birds before. I was filming a friend of mine, and we had a couple birds we were working, one way off in distance and one fairly close, within 75, 80 yards. And he didn't gobble. And I said, he's either going, he quit gobbling, basically. I said, he's either going to that other bird in the distance or he's coming to us. But either way, he's on the move. Once he had been gobbling regularly. And as soon as he stops gobbling, he's on the move. That means he's walking somewhere. And I'm like, be ready. And I wasn't looking at my buddy. I'm just sitting there filming. I'm like this. I got my video camera up. Let me describe it for the listeners. I'm sitting up filming over his shoulder, basically. And I've got my camera up in my freehanding it. And I'm looking in that viewfinder. And I got like right against my face. I'm trying to stay concealed. I feel like the smaller I make myself, the more concealed I am. And so I'm not really looking at my buddy. I'm just kind of looking right over the top of the viewfinder, and I'm looking at the viewfinder, what it's aiming at, and I'm just pointing it in the direction I last heard that gobbler, and I'm ready. And all of a sudden, I see a flicker of movement. It'd been like 8 or 9 minutes. And I thought it was a squirrel, and I'm sitting there staring at it. Finally, I see the head pop up, and I'm like, there he is, right in front of us. Well, this whole time, my buddy had his gun just laying across his lap, and I didn't realize it. And so now he had to come up real quick. And you're talking about a 3-foot gap in the foliage that this gobbler stepped into. There was no chance of him getting it. As soon as he started to move to get his gun up, that bird's gone. So in those situations, you better be ready. But I like that. That's what makes it so intense and so exciting for me because, at a moment's notice, he could be standing right there within 15 yards of you. And most of my shots in the late season are under 20 yards.
Wow.
Well, I don't know. Again, I probably didn't answer your question.
No, that was good.
I get to talk about turkey, man.
Yep.
Turkey stories. I wanted to, what you were talking about, how the things changed, did remind me to talk about this. You see this often with people talking about, I've seen birds here during the year, and then they all just disappear. But there's so much going on, especially up here in the Midwest, in that mid to late May time frame. There's so much agriculture, farming activity that's really firing up. Fields are getting dissed under, getting planted, getting sprayed. I see that affect turkeys. It has the biggest change. I noticed that's the biggest change. Where this week, because I'll hunt Minnesota like the last 3 weeks of May. And that first week I hunt them, the fields are pretty much the same as they were in the early season, other than they're starting to green up with natural vegetation and the foliage is starting to, things are budding out. And then that second week, all of a sudden there's tractors in every field. They're preparing to plant for the season. And where you saw turkeys out there strutting one day, now there's nothing in those fields. You ride by them, you never see anything. And so there's changes. Not only is the greening up, but there's farm activities. There's other activity. There's people out there mushroom hunting. So things are constantly birds are being bumped around. They're changing their food sources. I don't know what the point of that was, but I guess these folks that they spend all this time just kind of glassing from the road and spotting turkeys, and then they scratch their head like, where did the turkeys go? Turkeys are going to follow the food sources. They're going to avoid disruptions, and so that as things change in the spring, you got to adapt to those things.
For sure.
We've had a couple of guys on here, that have been chasing the slam and whatnot. I mean, and they get into how they prepare for going into a new area. So like you're going into a new state that say you don't hunt the southeast very much. You're going into a new state and you don't never have any experience in there. What are you going to do before you get to the state to help you find turkeys? I know a lot of guys, they'll say, I'm going to go to the state's website and I'm going to look at harvest data and stuff like that. Is there something beyond that? Are you attracted? You're obvious in eastern hardwoods. You say you prefer that, or are you going to, target certain terrain features that you're going to look for?
The internet's a great tool these days, and it makes scouting so much easier than it did when I was younger. When I was younger, it was paper maps. And they didn't have any satellite images on it. It was just like paths where the logging trucks went, Right. Nowadays, it makes it so easy. You got the DNR websites, the obvious stuff you can go to, the harvest stuff. I've glanced at that. But primarily when I'm going to a state, I'm not picking an area because I want to get a tag or, fill a tag there to get a U.S. slam. I usually try to pick areas where the season's open, where I can maintain a hunting season as long as I can from March till June, And so say I pick a state that ends up doing that. I say, I'm free this week. Which state's open? Never hunted there. I'm looking, I used to hunt, a lot of these little smaller tracks and kind of look for these overlooks. But if I'm going out of state, oftentimes I'll look for these bigger tracks. Obviously, the bigger tracks are going to attract other hunters because they're doing the same thing. They're looking at these big tracks of public. But I like the bigger tracks because it gives me one location to focus on where I can cover ground. You know what I'm saying? So if you get to looking at too many small tracks, then like what I was talking about earlier about locating birds in the evening or whatever, they're too far apart for me to cover. So if I can get one large track, then I can cover, hear a gobbler in the distance. He's still going to be on that piece of public, if that makes sense. And so I'm not really concerned about harvest numbers at that point. I'm trying to find an ideal area that suits me as far as turkeys are usually, if there's good habitat for it, there's some turkeys there in most cases. And, it's a tricky question to answer. I do lean towards those harvest days. When you see a county especially the states that have like the counties and they have them color coded by harvest, and you can it creates kind of like a heat map. You can kind of see a general area of the state. Another thing that I do, that probably a lot of people don't, I travel so much around the country. Anytime I see a dead turkey or a live turkey as I'm driving the roads, I drop a pin on OnX. If you're seeing, especially dead turkeys, if you're seeing turkeys getting hit by vehicles, there's a lot of turkeys in that area.
Right.
There was one stretch I went through Indiana, and in a 10-mile stretch, I saw like 4 or 5 dead turkeys on the side of the road. And I'm like, this is definitely a place I need to hunt because it's loaded in this area. But yeah, I mean, I depending on where I'm hunting, South Dakota, I can tell you the story about out there. That's a little trickier to figure out if there's turkeys there because, it's so open. And there was this one spot a public that I was going to hunt, middle of nowhere. And I didn't know if there was turkeys there. It looked like from the satellite images, there could be some big enough trees to hold them. I couldn't tell if the creeks were dried up or not. I called. I looked on Google Maps, zoomed in. It was like a little convenience store there in this little crossroad, and like 3 buildings there. Called the store, got the number from Google Maps, and guy answered the phone, and I was like, "This is gonna sound like a weird question, but I'm a turkey hunter in Minnesota. I'm coming out to South Dakota to hunt this spring, and there's a little place up the road that I'm thinking about hunting. Could you tell me if you ever see turkeys in the area, like across the road?" I was like, "Oh yeah, there's plenty of turkeys around here." He said, "I see them in town sometimes." I said, "Oh, okay, that's all I need to know," you know. And so I've used that to my advantage scouting. I don't know. There's so much you can look at, but I usually, back to the point about looking at the harvest rates, I don't know. I don't really scout as thorough as I used to. I used to be so paranoid about wanting to get there and make sure there's turkeys there. Usually I just focus on the habitat. I'm gonna assume there's turkeys there, and I'm looking for what I think turkeys desire, and that's what I'm gonna focus on. And a lot of times I get there's turkeys there.
All right. I guess a lot of it would probably be, you gotta get boots on the ground to get in there and see what's actually about. You can only learn so much from looking at maps and satellite images.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I've told people this before. It's a funny thing not knowing something about a place. If you know a place very well and you never kill a turkey there, you never hear a turkey there, you're not going to hunt it. But if I go there and you don't tell me this, I'll kill a turkey there because I don't know any better. It's what you don't know sometimes is more helpful than what you know.
Yeah, for sure.
You go in there without that knowledge of that it's not a very good place. You go in there with a lot of optimism, and that usually helps you. Go in there with a lot of optimism, a lot of confidence that this is going to be the day, and then somehow you luck up. Mississippi, I think, is a good example of that. I went and hunted along the river there that one year in April. I was telling you guys earlier about April in Mississippi, how it's good. I had somebody message me. He said, "Man, I know where you're hunting." He said, "There ain't no turkeys there." He said, "They done killed them all." They got them in the first couple weeks of the season. And I wasn't finding much turkey sign. The river had been flooded, and it finally drained down to where the bottoms. And I got lucky. I finally struck a gobbler, like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and I killed him, But I didn't go in there with that. I didn't have that knowledge that they had pounded that place and that there was hardly any birds left in there, and, or not gobbling. They'd already pushed them onto the private.
That was the one where you went in with a kayak, right?
Yeah. That's the one. Yeah, had he not gobbled, I probably would have never thought about hunting that place again because it was that bad. I was on the phone with Catman. I was like, "Man, this place sucks." That's what I told him. And then I got off the phone and made a call bird gobble. I was like, "Oh, it doesn't suck after all."
So I was gonna ask, man, kind of going back to the late season. Over here in the upper Midwest, the days get really, really long. Are you hunting all day, or like how does that schedule look? Because it's tough. It's tough for me to be out there early season. I'll be out there all day, and then I just start to notice kind of once it gets into late season, man, it's hard for me to be out there all day. I'll be out there till maybe 2:30, and then I'm kind of going and getting lunch and stuff.
Now add cameras and batteries to that you got to dump footage every evening and charge batteries. That makes your day even longer. So I used to try to go at it all day, and I find myself getting 2 hours sleep at night, and then I would doze off. Mid-morning I'd get really drowsy, or 1 o'clock.
That's me.
Yeah.
That's me.
So what my so I'm gonna end up napping anyway because I'm so freaking tired. So I have a strategy for it. I don't have much success in the afternoon anyway. Most of my success comes from like 1, 2 p.m. or earlier. Most of it's actually before noon. And so my strategy is in the evening, locate birds. I sleep in my truck most times when even if I'm hunting in Minnesota, I'm 2 hours from the house, an hour from the house. I just sleep in my truck because by the time you waste that hour driving home, you could be sleeping. Anyway, So I try to get to sleep. It's by 10 p.m. at the latest, or not 10 p.m., like 11 p.m. Because for listeners not in the Minnesota upper Midwest area, it does not get dark here, completely dark, until almost 10 p.m. in late May, 9:30 to 10 p.m. Anyway, I'll make it simple here. I roost birds in the evening. I go to bed as soon as I can after I get something to eat or whatever. The next morning, we're up at like 3 a.m., getting ready to go out there, get to set up on this gobble we roosted. Let's say that doesn't work out. We hunt hard, hopping around, covering ground, trying to locate gobblers up until about 1 to 2 p.m. At that point, we get something to eat and we take a nap. Either in the woods, we take a nap and then go get lunch. But that afternoon from 1 or 2 p.m. until roost time, we're not doing anything in the woods. We may call from the road, ride around. It's very relaxing style in the afternoon because, like I said, I haven't had much success in that time frame. There's no sense in just burning yourself out, especially if you're going for a couple of days, that's one thing. But I'm hunting for 4 or 5 days straight. Then I'm taking a two or 3 day break to work my regular job. And then I'm hunting, 3 or 4 or 5 days straight again. So you get burned out real quick. So that's my strategy. I'm going at it very hard from 3 a.m. to 1 p.m. And then I roost birds in the evening. Just kind of take it easy in the afternoon.
For sure.
Right. I always have the plan that I'm going to go in somewhere, generally where I've not been before. I'm going to pull up a tree. I may call a little bit, but then I'm going to roll over and try to take a nap.
Now here's
in theory, it's a good idea, but when I'm laying there on the ground trying to take a nap, I'm always hearing the phantom gobbles and stuff. I try to shut my brain off, and I do a pretty good job, but I can't shut my ears off, and I'm always listening, so I don't ever get to sleep.
That's one of my favorite strategies there is when I'm getting drowsy and I'm going to take a nap, I don't just take a nap. I make some calls. Like I may cut a little bit and do some aggressive calling and yelping, and then I'll take a nap. And what's going to happen is a gobbler 300, 400 yards away may have heard it. And it may take him an hour to get to you. He may slowly make his way there. But when he gets there, he's going to probably gobble or make some noise to relocate this hen that he heard 45 minutes earlier. And he's going to wake you up. So don't waste your nap. Make a call and consider your nap waiting patiently.
Right.
But I do the same thing you do. The problem is, as I've gotten older, I sleep harder, deeper. I used to sleep, I'd go to sleep, but the slightest sound would wake me up. I'd hear a spit of a gobbler. I'd hear a soft hen yelp in the distance, or a turkey gobble in the distance, and I'd wake up immediately. My conscious was tuned to that. But now it's gotten to the point that I'm hearing these phantom ones in my dreams. I was in Mississippi a few years ago, and I was dead tired. The sun's getting warm on you, peeking through the leaves, and you're like, oh, this feels so good. A bed of leaves is so soft. It's better than any mattress. But anyway, I dozed off. And while I'm laying there, all of a sudden I hear, so loud, that gobbler. He had to be within shotgun range. It was super loud. And I just opened my eyes wide open. And my camera, I have a 360 camera, I run, and I left it rolling in like a loop mode, 30-minute loop mode. And I'm sitting there laying on my back. My gun's across I think it was beside me or something. And I'm sitting there like, okay, what am I going to do? So I'm just moving like creeping. And long story short, I finally get, slowly up and where I can look around, and I don't see a bird anywhere. And I yelp softly and no response. And I yelp softly and no response. I get a little louder and never see a bird. I'll go back and watch that video footage. That camera was rolling. And I'm looking at my face, and at the point where my eyes pop open, wide open, there was never a gobbler on that video, no audio of a gobble. I obviously dreamed a gobble, and it shocked me awake.
Right.
So don't be fooled by the dreams either.
That's happened to me before. And it was kind of amazing. Like, I loved it, man. Like, I woke up, like, I was just normal
It
sleeping.
was real. It sounded real.
Yeah,
huh?
and I woke up and I was like, man, that's nuts, man, that I'm hearing gobbles, you know? And it turns out, though, I actually was hearing gobbles because where I lived at the time, our house bordered a park. And then my wife ends up telling me something. She was talking to the neighbor that she had like some turkeys at her glass door, like looking at their reflection in the mirror, like
Oh,
the
yeah.
other day. And I was like, well, shoot, man, then I was hearing turkeys, man.
Talking about, just a question for you. Have you ever found yourself, new to an area, calling to a pen gobbler?
I can't say that I've ever been fooled by, well, completely fooled by a pet turkey, because they sound like Miriams. You know, that's. I was watching a show about the history of turkeys, and they were actually derived. I think the domestic turkey was derived from the Gould's turkey in Mexico, and they all sound like farmyard birds. All these Western birds. So it's hard for them to fool me because I can tell the difference when I'm hunting an eastern than a pet bird. Now, I will say this. I was hunting in South Carolina one year, and we have easterns, obviously, and I heard a gobble. I was on my way back to the truck. It was very windy that day. And if you've been in a pine forest, you know how the pine trees, when the wind's going through it, it's like a, that sound and not rustling leaves. But it was like, and I heard, just a faint of, and I'm like, oh, that's a turkey gobble. And so I set up on it, and I called, and it gobbled back to me, but I could barely hear it over the wind. Finally, there was a slight lull in the wind, and I called. He gobbled. I said, that ain't no eastern. That's got to be somebody's pet. And so I started walking to it, and sure enough, I didn't realize right across on the property, I could see through the trees, I could see like a mobile home, and somebody had like it was like a dog kennel, and they had a pet turkey in the dog kennel. So it didn't fool me to the extent that, I never really heard his gobble until the wind died down. And so, that really hasn't happened. Now, if I was out in South Dakota and somebody had a pet turkey, oh yeah, it would fool me because they sound just like them out there.
Cool. I did it my first year hunting up here in Minnesota. But late in the morning. Yeah, I wasn't real familiar with the area, and it was late in the morning. It was actually probably, almost closing time when I sat down and started calling, and I heard it respond. And time finally ran out, and I had to back out of there, and I was like, well, we got to drive around and see what's going on over there. And get back to the road, and we drive around, and the closer we get, then you can see the house, and then you can see the yard, and then you can see the pen with the gobbler sitting in the pen.
It's so disappointing when you realize it.
I spent about an hour, I think, calling to him. And I was like, man, he's got to be coming. He's got to be coming. No, he couldn't come.
Yeah. I know I was very disappointed when that wind died down and I heard that bird clearly. And I was like, oh, God. I was so excited that because, I'd hunted hard. This is a piece of public land that gets hunted pretty good in South Carolina. And I'd hunted hard. This was like, you're looking around noon, I guess. I was on my way back out. Been in there since 5 o'clock in the morning. And finally struck one. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's on. He's coming right to the gun because, you strike one at like 10, 11, 12 o'clock. They're dead, gobbler. But he wouldn't budge, and then the wind died down, and I was like, oh, so depressed afterwards.
All right, dude. So I think we're going to let you go, man.
Thank you for listening to the Off the Roost podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, or whatever it is we're supposed to do. We'd greatly appreciate it. You can also follow us on Instagram at Off the Roost Calls and TikTok at Off the Roost Pod. Stay tuned for future episodes where we'll do our best to keep you informed and try to preserve the heritage that surrounds the elusive and sometimes mystical animal that is the wild turkey.